We are really excited to be here today and to be starting this second edition. First of all, we wanted to say thank you to our sponsors. So after the success of our first edition back in June, we partnered up with the BNA and with Defense, and they've been incredibly helpful and really supportive. So first of all, we wanted to thank them for all the help. And some important notes before we start. First of all, regarding the recording, we are currently recording this presentation, and we also record the main talk, and probably we'll post them in our YouTube channel, but your video and the question and answers won't be recorded, so no pressure in that regard. Secondly, regarding the questions and answers, feel free to ask whatever and whenever through the chat. So whenever you guys have a question, you write the question in the chat, and Alba will be taking notes of all the questions. And then once the talk is finished, she will be asking the questions to our speaker. And once the question is answered, if you guys want to add something else, then you will have the chance to do it. And finally, regarding the length, we aim to close this session at 4:30 p.m. UK time, but of course, you're free to leave earlier. And that said, hello world. We are Corpus Curiosum, and as you might have noticed, our name is similar to Corpus Curiosum, right? And this is because, as you know, the Corpus Curiosum is the part of the brain that keeps together, let's say, and communicates the two hemispheres, right? And this is kind of what we want to create in this space. So we want to create a space of communication among the different fields in neuroscience with one objective, which is stimulating critical thinking in neuroscience. Because even if critical thinking and having a critical view and approach is essential in any scientist's life, right? Sometimes we are so embedded in our labs, in our experiment, in publishing a paper that we kind of forget this kind of critical attitude. And that's why we wanted to create a space that aims to stimulate this skill, because as we all know, it's essential in our careers, right? This is us, Faisal, Alba, and Ines. We are at different stages in our career, in our research career, and also we come from different backgrounds. And this is you. So for this first session, we have people coming from 31 different countries. So this is really impressive, folks, and we wanted to thank you all for being here. So we have 31 different countries and more than 100 different institutions. So yeah, this makes us, of course, really happy and excited. And that said, it's time to present our first speaker. So this is Dr. Gina Rippon. We are incredibly happy to have Dr. Gina Rippon talking in here today. In case someone doesn't know her yet, Dr. Gina Rippon is a professor emeritus of cognitive neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Center at Aston University in Birmingham. Her research involves the application of brain imaging techniques using cognitive neuroscience paradigms to studies of to the normal and abnormal cognitive processes, right? The issue here is that in 2019, Dr. Rippon published her book, Gender Brain, the new neuroscience that shatters the myth of the female brain, which is absolutely a must, which investigates the role of life experience and biology in brain development and the traditionally reported differences among women's and men's brains. And this is what we are going to be talking today. And now, Gina, you can take over and you do your presentation. If you want, you can start sharing your
screen. I'll just say thank you very much indeed for inviting me and for such a nice introduction. And I wish I'd actually known there was going to be a poll and seen the poll results before I started, because we could just have cut to the end of the talk and talked about people's beliefs that they're bringing to this talk. But I will, in fact, get on with my talk and try and remember what the poll results are. And hopefully people will also ask questions via the chat option throughout, and then we'll get to those at the end. So I will share my screen if I can find it. Here we are. And I can't close the poll, which is blocking my screen. I don't know if you can get rid of that. Okay. I don't know if you can. I'm sorry. I can shut it. Right. Okay. That should be good. Okay. Thank you very much for everybody for coming. 31 countries. That's a bit daunting, but exciting too, because I think it's a very important question. It's a very old question, as I'll touch on briefly. And it's something that affects everybody, because we've all got brains, we've all got a gender of some kind, and we live our lives, and we have lived experiences which we feel make us experts on whether or not there are male and female brains, and what the consequences are for the owners of those brains and the significance, because it's not just an anatomical question, it's are our brains different? So as Inez mentioned, I wrote a book last year. I'm actually a neuroscientist, and I'll talk a bit about that briefly. In the UK, it was called The Gendered Brain. In the US and in Spain, it was called Gender and Our Brains, different titles for different reasons. But really, it's about an age-old argument whether men's and women's brains are different, and if they are, and that's something that we need to think about, how they get to be different. And probably more significantly, for understanding science and using science and following the science, which is a kind of favourite phrase in current circumstances, what is the significance of those differences for ourselves and for policy, education, parenting, etc. Now, just briefly, I can change. Just say, as was mentioned, I am a cognitive neuroscientist, and I use brain imaging techniques. I work in the Aston Brain Centre, Birmingham in the UK. And we're lucky enough, we have all the standard techniques. So we have very traditional techniques like EEG, which actually have now been sort of upgraded to much more sophisticated ways of looking at brain activity. We have fMRI techniques, and we also have a technique which looks at the magnetic field associated with the electrochemical changes in brain activity. That's a fairly unusual setup, a fairly unusual technique, but is actually giving us lots of insights into how the brain works. And I think that's quite important, because we'll come back to the idea that somehow the questions being asked in this area have really got stuck in what I call the size matters agenda, the idea that if we're looking for differences, we just measure different bits in the brain, and that'll give us kind of insight. So I need to come back to that. And the kind of images that we can present, which again I'll come back to, are the standard images, which are people are familiar with, and which more than just scientists are familiar with. And again, I think that's important, because these images have proved a way of communicating what we brain scientists do to the wider public, to people with a personal interest in brain science, or just a general knowledge type interest. But sometimes those images themselves can actually cause a problem. So what Inez and her team asked me to do was to say, rather than kind of go through all of the issues which are raised in the book, which if those of you who've seen the book, it is quite a long book, is actually to talk about research, to say, this is a question that we've been considering for many, many years, and there are different sorts of research techniques that have been applied to that question. And rather than just accept blindly what is reported that research is finding, we ought to perhaps go behind the scenes a bit, and find out how good the research is, not necessarily in terms of it being bad research or fraudulent, but really to understand where the scientists are coming from in looking at these kind of issues. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes or so. Right, so Hunt the Difference agenda. I've called it the Hunt the Difference agenda because this Hunt the Difference has actually informed, and I think, as I indicated in my title, quite possibly distorted how we do research. Because it didn't used to be a question as to whether women's and men's brains were different. It was a given. The emerging in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the emerging science of brain studies, the scientists assumed that there was a difference between male and female brains, and their efforts were actually focused on finding those differences. And they made that assumption because they looked at the status quo in society and in the world and said, well, women are clearly inferior to men. And there's a nice quotation here from a nice objective scientist. Women represent the most inferior forms of human evolution and are closer to children and savages than to an adult civilized man. And the same scientists also did kindly acknowledge that there were occasionally quite bright women, but they were so rare that they could be compared with two-headed gorillas, for example. So just to bear in mind that one of the questions I noticed in the poll was about bias in science. Probably not as overt nowadays as it is then, but it's really clear that the origins of this research gender were focused on a very clear belief about how society was organized and how they as scientists were going to explain these differences. And at that point, and I won't go into this in detail, but you're probably familiar with the sort of history of brain science, in that obviously we couldn't at that stage have access to an intact living human brain in an intact living human carrying out the kind of task we're interested in. We could only look at, for example, skulls, fill them with birdseed and weigh the birdseed and make conclusions about the size of the brains that were in that skull. Or we could feel bumps on the surface of the skull, phrenology. Or we could actually start devising metrics which gave us an indirect clue as to what the brain was like inside the head. And there's this very strange technique called craniology, which was very much to do with measuring the different angles of your forehead and your earlobe and your chin, etc. And that, in theory, gave a clue as to what the brain inside that head was like. And it was one of those skills which kind of multiplied over time. And there was one paper, a craniology paper, there was over 500 different measures to tell you what the brain was like that you were looking at. All sorts of conclusions drawn about this, big excitement when it was discovered that on average, and that's a phrase we'll come back to, men's brains are about 5 ounces heavier than women. So the idea was that, oh, men have got bigger brains and that explains why they're superior. Again, you know, the size matters of gender in this particular debate. And then somebody pointed out that actually just having a bigger brain didn't necessarily make you, leader of the universe kind of thing, because sperm whales and elephants, for example, have got big brains. So we need to find a different way of coming up with the right answer. And that phrase is quite important, because one of the ways in which these metrics were used were to answer a given. The given was that there was a scale out there at the top of which a hierarchy were white, because it also intersected with race research, middle class, upper class, so class was another issue, male individuals. Lower down there were females and children, then there were other classes, and even lower there were other races and savages. So there was a clearly pre-established hierarchy that researchers were looking at supporting. And importantly, again, of what we're going to be talking about later, if any of the metrics didn't come up with that answer, if, for example, there was a particular measure which showed women for some reason superior to men, then the metrics were dumped. So I think, again, that's an interesting warning, if you like, that researchers bear in mind that sometimes metrics don't give the answer you expect, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the metrics. It may well be there's something wrong with the answer you assume that you're researching. Okay, so this is the origin of these kind of questions that were being asked. And what was then come up with, apologies for this busy slide trying to pack everything in at the same time. The idea was very, very straightforward. You've got 2 types of body, two types that led to 2 types of brain. So whatever it was, and early on, of course, we didn't as yet know about the genotypes, whatever it was that caused female anatomy to be different also caused the brain to be different, and similarly with male anatomy. So there were 2 types of body, which meant that there were 2 types of brain. And those 2 types of brain had a very specific, different developmental journey. So a boy brain would arrive into the world perhaps already endowed with some of those skills which were going to ensure that he became a leader of man, a huge success financially, won the Nobel Prize, whatever. And so you've got a nice, clear, fixed, unidirectional journey, which resulted in a particular kind of brain belonging to a man. And similarly, with the female brain, arrived slightly different, slightly smaller in the world, didn't necessarily arrive with the kind of skills that would ensure world success, if you like. And in fact, in the 19th century, there was a suggestion that the female brain was actually rather fragile and shouldn't be exposed to the dangers of higher education. And there was reference to disorders such as anorexia scholastica, which was going to happen if you exposed women to particular kinds of education. At the end of that developmental journey, you got a female brain, so a very fixed type of organ, which had particular characteristics, which I've cartooned here as, you know, emotionally labile, like dressing up or being a princess in a kind of 21st century view. So we have a nice unidirectional pathway linked in one directional causal, and at the end of which there are fixed endpoints. And associated with those particular kind of brains, the experimental psychologists joined in as well and said, well, if you've got a female brain, then these are the kind of skills that go with it. So if you've got a lady brain, very good at empathy, but rubbish at reading maps. If you've got a man brain, you're not so good at reading, understanding emotions, but you're very good at sciencey type subjects. Okay, so, and you're not very good at listening. And owning those, having that particular kind of brain, bringing with it a particular portfolio of skills meant that you had particular roles in society. So you were going to be a leader of man, or a huge success in whatever enterprise you undertook. So man, the winner, whereas women were much better at networking and caring, and therefore were well suited for caring roles. So this was the argument that was established right from the beginning by assuming that brains were different, and assuming that because of those differences, there were all kinds of different skills which gave men and women different roles in society. Remember that all of these took place, all of these theories evolved before we could properly look at brains. So you could say, well, all of this is very simplistic. I think some of it was probably touched on in the polls that we just looked at, but surely things have changed. Well, let's have a look at some commentary on the kind of research that was fed by this particular type of theory, this essentialist pathway, biology is destiny, etc., and see if it's actually changed. Okay, so two particular comments that I've identified, and I'll read them, appreciating that they're written in English, and apologies if English is not your first language. So turn of the last century, there is perhaps no field aspiring to be scientific where flagrant personal bias, logic martyred in the cause of supporting a prejudice, unfounded assertions, and even sentimental rot and drivel have run riot to such an extent as here. So this was Mary Woolley commenting on research into sex differences. So not a great accolade, but maybe that was to do with, you know, not being supported by the wonderful advances of brain science that we now have. But generally there was a feeling that this wasn't a great research area. There was all sorts of personal agendas involved. Fast forward then to Cordelia Fine, 100 years later, in fact. When we follow the trail of contemporary science, we discover a surprising number of gaps, assumptions, inconsistencies, poor methodologies, and leaps of faith, as well as more than one echo of the insalubrious past. So in a way, this is saying that, okay, it's not got a great history, this kind of research, but it doesn't seem to have improved much. So I guess the rest of what I'm going to be saying is why we might come to that conclusion. Certainly as anybody doing research in that area, there's a kind of caveat, warning note to be sounded. But anybody who's interested in the outcomes of research without being perhaps experts in that research, it's also a caveat to say we need to be very careful. This is a very important area. And that is something I should actually said from the beginning and will say at the end. I'm not a sex difference denier. I do think that there are differences between the brains of men and the brains of women, and the use of the term male and female is again something I'll come back to. this is the idea that if we've got what Simon Baron-Cohen has called in his book fixed hardwired differences, so the female brain is hardwired for empathy, quote, or the male brain is hardwired for understanding systems, quote, we need to say this is an argument about something which is fixed and unchangeable and invariant and inevitable. And so we might need to see how carefully research is actually answering this. Okay, so as I've said several times, this was actually before brain imaging arrived. So what happened when brain imaging did arrive? And this is when we start to get amazing images like this. And as I said, this was a key point in science as a whole, the development of science as a whole, but in particular in neuroscience. Because rather than having, as we had with EEG, unfolding paper records with squiggly lines on which somebody needed to interpret, we suddenly had another way of communicating our findings. And these were very powerful, have been described as very seductive, because the impression given, and I've cartooned that here, is that we instantly had access to what's going on in the brain in real time, the invisible made visible. So there was a feeling that scientists at last had got a handle on the differences that in fact a lot of people already knew, that men and women's brains were different, so scientists were going to be able to get a real handle on explaining this, and there were all sorts of consequences for that, for understanding these kinds of differences. But unfortunately, these are kind of illusory images. They are wonderfully impressive, seductive. You instantly think, oh look, there's a part of the brain which is lit up when somebody's doing something, another part of the brain is lit up, and indeed that's the kind of terminology which is used. But one of the things in which is significant in brain imaging, and particularly significant in looking for brain differences, is that all these images are actually of differences. The way in which brain imaging works is very often your participants in the scanner, they lie in the scanner, you give them a kind of neutral task, and you collect the brain imaging data, then you give them the task you're interested in, a memory task, a language task, a social engagement task, whatever it is, lots and lots of brain data. And then you go through a very, very long chain of statistical decisions, of image manipulation, not manipulation in the kind of fraudulent sense, but in terms of adjusting the image to match all of the data that you've got. And what you then see at the end of it is that you've got a hugely active brain doing the neutral task, and a hugely active brain doing the significant task. So what you do is you take one set of data from the other, hoping against hope, if you're doing a task, that you'll find a difference. And then you'll say, well, we need to be able to communicate that difference, so we'll adjust the threshold so that just the differences come through. Again, not fraudulent, but making sure that the story that you're telling or the images you're producing actually support the story that you're telling. So what you're actually looking at here is not a brain doing nothing until some particular task is undertaken. It's a task where brain was really active, and there's a certain amount of activity here which has been thresholded so that all the background noise, in inverted commas, is removed, and you can focus in on this part of the brain here. Now, again, this isn't fraudulent, but it means that what you see is not necessarily as straightforward as it appears. And I think that's really important in sex differences, because the same is true if you're comparing groups of males and groups of females. The one thing you will know if you brain image in males and females is that the data is imperceptibly different, and actually possibly not different, as we'll come to later. So you're not getting nice dramatic differences which are going to support the story you want to tell. You're getting differences which you have to manipulate, you have to make decisions about. And of course, those decisions are informed by the fact that you already believe there's a difference, that you've grouped your individuals into two sets of people, male people and female people. And those are the differences with which you interrogate your data. So you're already bringing a belief to your brain imaging data. And it's really important to remember that. The other thing is, as we'll come back to later, is huge amounts of variability in the data. even if you've got, you know, thousands of men and thousands of women. There's not kind of common characteristic of both types of data. Huge amount of variability. Now, you don't want that as a research scientist. You want to get rid of the variance. You want to find the significant differences. So you average away all of that variability. So quite possibly the really interesting characteristics, which you should be looking at, you're actually getting rid of, because your agenda is that I'm really focusing on the difference. I want to know why that group is different from that group. I'm not really interested in why that group, which is apparently all the same because they're all men, or all the same because they're all women, where that variability comes from. And we will come back to that. But you could say that once brain imaging arrived and we did have these techniques, even though if they were a bit, could be a bit misleading, that was a great start to say, right, let's really have a look at how the brain works in any individual. Let's have a look at how they solve problems. Let's have a look at where things go wrong, for example. But the hunt for difference agenda did in fact continue to inform brain research right from the beginning. So one of the very early studies that I've indicated here was based on the assumption that men and women processed language differently in the brain. There was always an idea that, which linked a bit to the kind of right hemisphere, left hemisphere story, which is another whole story. The idea that women were very good at language, and men found language slightly more difficult and more likely to lose language if there was damage for some kind. So the very first study, I think about the second study that was ever published in brain imaging literature, it was only, I think, 19 women and 19 men, and gave them 4 different language tasks. And then they found that actually there was no difference between the groups in 3 of the language tasks, but luckily in one of the 4 language tasks, they did find a difference. And this was what was reported, and actually was one of the very first brain imaging, you know, at last the truth, public media got hold of the story. Now neuroscientists are able to explain to us why women are better at this or men are better at that, moving on as inevitably to the kind of men are from Mars, women are from Venus type story, which we'll come back to. But this was a quite compelling image. It looked as though, yes, women process language on both sides of the brain, and men process language just on this side of the brain. And the way in which the brain images were presented then was meant this was actually the left side of the brain. So men process language to the left side of the brain, women with both. Behind that story is the fact that, as I said, three of the language studies showed no difference. And in this study, it's worth noting that there were 19 women. It was only 11 who actually showed this kind of bilateral activation. So big report that more than half of the females showed a difference. Well, 11 of 90 out of 19, okay, more than half, but you know, what about the rest? So this is just a flag that early on, the kind of hype associated with these reports is something we should keep an ear out for. Anyway, the way in which this continued really suggested that there is some kind of bias associated with the research. And Cordelia Fine, in typically trenchant terms, coined the term neurosexism and said a lot of the research going on in the name of sex differences research is a literature bias towards the presentation of sex differences in the brain as extensive, functionally significant, and fixed, and therefore implicitly supportive of a gender essentialist perspective. Well, I highlighted extensive, functionally significant, and fixed because I think that was very much the story right from the beginning. Particularly, they meant something. They were fixed and they were pretty widespread. And this is what the brain images themselves were also reporting. So we need to move on and say, okay, so let's have a look and see how this brain imaging body of research has unfolded. This is what I call the iceberg problem. And very often when we get into debates about sex differences research, there will be trenchant statements from, and I have to say it does tend to be kind of adversarial. So one group will say, thousands of brain imaging studies have shown that there are sex differences in the adult brain, in the adult human brain. Therefore, anybody who does not support the idea that male brains are different from female brains is putting political ideology above scientific reality. Now, it is true that if you go to the literature, there are thousands of studies, for example, like this, sex differences in the adult human brain, evidence from over 5,000 participants, because we've moved on from the days of a dozen or 19 participants. We can now look at thousands of participants. That's great, really good. And there's a list in this paper, for example, saying that the amygdala and the hippocampus, among others, particular parts of the brain which are different. So hurrah, science has got the answer. And yet along comes another set of papers, meta-analysis in this case, looking at all of the studies which have investigated, in this case, the amygdala and the hippocampus. And they said, but actually, if we look at all these studies, there isn't a consensus. So you can't say on the basis of one study, at last we know what it is that makes a brain male. It's got a bigger hippocampus or a bigger amygdala. Because if you look at all the studies, there is no consistency. And I think that's very important, because as researchers, we might know this. As researchers talking to other individuals, we might communicate this. But if, say, a journalist or somebody is interested in education policy or believes that the boys should be taught differently from girls, they can quickly scan what's available in the research literature. They won't go through each paper and say, oh gosh, 100 of those said the amygdala is bigger, but another 960 said there was no difference. So we get an illusion of consistency because there's lots and lots of papers. We assume that research, we've come up with the answer. So that's one particular issue that we need to bear in mind. There is no consistency. And that's really important because there again is this illusion that we neuroscientists can now say, okay, I know what it is that makes a brain male or a brain female. A bit like, pathologists in those police procedurals where they pick up a bone and say, oh, I know this, this is the pelvic bone of a female. I cannot, you could not give me a set of brain images and say, please, could you tell me which of those are male and which of those are female? I could not reliably answer that question. I could not select anybody from the audience I can't see and say, I'm going to take a male to my lab or a female to my lab and say, I know what their brain is going to be like. So this idea of the female brain or the male brain, which if you remember from the image I showed at the beginning, is what is informing a lot of research, does not hold up to the kind of research that is being published. Each of it is good research, but one of the problems is, of course, if you've got a hugely variable population of data, which we have, and I'll come back to that shortly, then one study might find a set of differences, but a different lab in a different environment with people who've had different experiences, and again, I'll come back to that, may well come up with a different difference. The other thing, the reason I call it the iceberg problem is a very characteristic problem in research. And that is, if you predict a difference and you find it, then you'll submit your, write up your paper and you'll publish it you'll submit it for publication. Pressures on researchers now is that the more papers they publish, the more likely they are to get grants, the more likely they are to keep their jobs, etc. So big pressure to come up with these papers. If you don't find a difference, that means that's a negative finding because you've predicted a difference. There is not we are going to catalogue the number of ways in which male brains are the same as female brains agenda as yet. So therefore, you might not submit the paper, or you might submit it and the reviewers might say, well, there's obviously something wrong with this research because they didn't come up with a difference, which echoes back, if you like, to the old kind of craniology measure. Let's get rid of the metric if it doesn't come up with the right answer. So the impression that research gives is misleading, and that's something that it's really important that we pay attention to. So moving on, the other issue is, if you remember, we talked about how extensive these findings are, and this is something which is very important, and sometimes I start these kind of talks with this kind of statistical image. What kind of differences are we actually talking about? Because again, if you're looking at a research agenda which is based on the idea that you're looking at male brains as different from female brains, or male behavior is different from female behavior, you assume the two groups are pretty distinct, that you should be able to predict how a male would behave or what a female brain should look like. And yet when we look at the kind of data that is generated both in brain imaging studies and in behavioral studies addressing this question, the data is not like this, which is two nice bell-shaped curves, certainly showing distribution, but not overlapping that much. This is in fact based on the differences between height in males and females. So generally, males are taller than females. You could describe males as taller than females, probably justifiably. You look at the average of the population, say, well, it's quite a big difference. There is, however, a certain amount of overlap here. So there are some men who are smaller than some women, and some women who are taller than some men, which is what that overlap means. But when we look at sex differences, both brain imaging data and behavioral differences, these are the kind of distributions you're getting. So you're looking at tiny, tiny little differences and drawing hugely significant functional assumptions from those differences. And I think that's something, again, which we need to filter our enthusiasm for research into sex differences through. These are the kind of differences you're looking at. Now, there is a move, and it is starting to be successful, that if you're going to be talking about differences, if you're going to be publishing papers on differences, certainly if they're in academic journals, the reviewer instructions or the author instructions will say you need to report what we call the effect size. So not just that there is a difference, but how significant is that difference? Is it the size of very overlapping populations? And should we therefore be careful about the assumptions we draw from those differences? And this is a paper, one of the early papers, which was celebrating the fact that brain imaging labs are now putting all their data together. So again, instead of your 19 or 20 participants, you can have thousands and you can make comparisons. And this was a very early study looking at a particular type of brain activation pattern, a resting state activation pattern in different parts of the brain, and reporting significant sex differences. Again, this is the kind of thing which goes out into the literature, which I'll come back to shortly, which suggests that, at last we scientists have caught up with what people in the world knew all along, that male, female brains are different. But if you look at the distribution of the differences they're reporting here, they are tiny. They're very, very tiny. So yes, maybe there are some anatomical differences. In this case, this was actually a pattern of brain activation, but they are the similar kind of differences you see in reporting anatomical differences. And that is important because, as I said, this isn't just an anatomical question. It's just saying, let's catalogue the ways in which male brains are different from female brains. We're also saying, and this means that, and this goes on to say, whether or not, as I've said before, boys and girls should be taught differently. It gives us any kind of insight into the huge numbers of gender gaps in the world, for example, in physical illness, mental illness, achievement, etc. So not reporting the difference is something that we need to be aware of, and which has informed quite a lot of the early research. The other thing that we need to think about is the idea that differences are fixed. And again, this is the whole kind of research agenda, which I could go into in detail. We used to think that there was a developmental endpoint in the brain, that once the brain had stopped growing, possibly late teens, maybe early 20s, moved on a bit, that was it. That was the brain that you had. That was the brain that was going to carry you through to old age, at which point disease or deterioration kicked in. But generally, and remember, brain imaging researchers are assuming that the participants they have in their lab are all much the same. You have a group of females, a group of male, possibly if you're working in a university, big group of students, you're looking at language differences or visual processing differences, find a difference. You get another lot in the next year, maybe that's part of their research training package. And then you're assuming that if you're interested in sex differences and you're dividing the groups into males and females, that females and males that you've got, their brains are pretty representative of all females and males because it's biologically determined. And I'm not going to get into the kind of issues of whether or not sex is binary at this point, but that would clearly be another issue that we need to think about. But if in fact the group of individuals you've got have had different experiences, we now know that will change their brains. And there's a very classic set of experiments done on taxi drivers, London black cab drivers in the UK, because they have to go through a really, really complicated training regime called the Knowledge, which involves them learning and being able to drive around something like 20,000 different routes within 6 miles of Charing Cross, which is something you now know, which you may not have known before. So a very complicated task, takes on average 3 or 4 years, sometimes a lot longer. And tracking taxi drivers before they undertook this training, while they're practicing as taxi drivers, and interestingly, once they'd retired, revealed there's a part of the brain which does change as they acquire this knowledge and use this knowledge. And interestingly, the changes disappear when they retire. So this is an indication that the brains you're looking at, if they've had different experiences, it may be those experiences, rather than the fact that they're males or females, have actually changed the brain. And there's other examples, for example, training somebody to juggle, looking at what their brain was like before, a very hard task of hand-eye coordination, showing what the brain was like before and after, and showing that those differences could change both the structure and the function of the brain. And this other image here is in fact looking at trying to help people who had difficulties with spatial processing, gave them 3 months of intensive Tetris training, and showed that getting people to play Tetris regularly, on a regular basis, could actually change both the structure and function of their brain, and interestingly, could actually improve their spatial processing. So teachers hate it when I show that particular slide, because it also applies to video games like Super Mario. So kids think this has got, is giving them free rein to make video game playing part of their education, but it does have an effect. And it's something, this brain plasticity has been noted in various other research arenas, but doesn't appear to have figured very strongly early on in looking at sex differences. Because of course, if you're looking at different individuals who have had different experiences, any differences you find may be due to that. It may actually be due that it is partly due to having sex differences. So if, for example, girls have different experiences from boys, then that may be what's behind the differences you're interested in. So Cordelia Fine and I wrote, and Rebecca Jordan-Young and another colleague wrote this paper saying, plasticity, and the rigid problem of sex. Because if we looked at brain research, it was very rarely referred to as something that should be taken into account. I think I need to move on. Now, I'm not going to be, you'll be pleased, go through this in detail. I'm just going to draw your attention to the fact that scientists themselves are sometimes less than cautious in how they report what they found. So there's 3 particular papers here, and again, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but one in particular, this paper did have quite a big impact on studies into how researchers communicated. Because as I said, with these wonderfully seductive images, people having interest in the brain, if there's a kind of whiff of a sex difference in a neuroscience journal, however obscure, very often this will get picked up by the popular press and reported. And when you look at the paper themselves, you can see that if an unwary journalist or an editor who's not versed in neuroscience terminology will say, well, look, this paper here is talking about fundamental sex differences. This paper is talking about prominent sex differences. We've got a paper here which is reporting different patterns of brain connectivity in male and female, and saying that that has significance because male brains, the way they're organized means they're better at spatial orienting, and female brains, the way they're organizing, they're better at language processing, etc. Now, each of these papers suffer a particular sin, and that is over-reporting what they actually found, which is what I called neurohype, where I'm saying that use of the terms like prominent, fundamental, for example, actually is misrepresenting what they found. This paper was, it's an image which is used a lot, and it's actually saying we've clearly found differences between male and female brains, male-female brains connected left to right, male brains connected anterior, posterior. And from that, they then made all sorts of conclusions about behavior, which they didn't actually measure in the scanner. So they kind of reached into the stereotyped ether and interpreted these data. Important to bear in mind. This paper also, these were the kind of size of the differences they reported, so very small. This particular paper, again, wonderful techniques looking at networks of activities supporting different particular kinds of perceptual and behavioral processes, very seductive images, and they reported particular male-female differences in patterns of functional connectivity. So illustrated with these kind of pathways here. Sex differences are prominent, data provide novel evidence, divergent patterns of cognition seen in males and females, differential patterns, etc. Now, this number here, which I've put as an aid memoir, was in fact that this particular technique involved over 34,000 different comparisons because of the way in which the networks were generated and the data was used. Absolutely fine. It was only 178 of those 34,000 comparisons which were actually statistically significant, still along those kind of lines. So talking about prominent sex differences, it may be that those 178 are the key to all the differences we've looked at, but there was no mention that there were actually 34,000 comparisons made. So slightly misleading. And again, this particular paper actually talked about spatial orienting and language in males and females, which they didn't measure at all. So they were just taking images of measuring connectivity patterns in male and females and saying, we're going to make clear conclusions about the significance of these. Now, I'm just going to move very quickly on through the next few slides, and I'm not going to spend ages talking about the text. It's just to say why it's important, not only for people who are going to go back to the original papers to read those and say, well, it says fundamental, but also people who might pick these up and then run with them in the way that media can do. So this is a, particularly if I can come across it. This is just to report, this was just tracking a particular story which followed reporting of a study which is actually interested in memory, males and female differences in memory. They were looking at males and they were showing them images of different genders in different levels of dress. I won't go into the details. It turned out that males were much better at remembering the bikini-clad images of women. You might say, might not need a brain scanner for that, but anyway, they were put in the brain scanner. And the way in which the scientists reported this finding was that when men were shown images of women in bikinis, areas of the brain that normally light up in anticipation of using tools like spanners and screwdrivers were activated. So that was how the scientists reported what they found. Now, this is kind of extreme image, which is it's a story, which is kind of lightening the tone a bit. This was taken up the next day by a UK paper called The Guardian, reporting the study that was found, but illustrating it with this particular image. Kind of understated, but it's pretty clear what's going on. If you said it's a particular part of the brain which is to do with using tools, then of course you might use this kind of image to illustrate it, but you have to think about the kind of impression that's being given. Next day, moved on, men view half-naked women as objects, study finds, with a rather less subtle image of the way in which this story is unfolding. So, you know, a neuroscientist says the part of the brain that's involved with using tools and screwdrivers, and this is what they get. And then you moved on to bikinis make men see women as objects. Moved on again for saying men were also likely to be associate images of sexualized women with first-person action verbs, such as I push, I grasp, I handle. So we've got language coming into it there as well. And then CNN, again, the kind of image, of course, you absolutely have to illustrate any interesting brain finding with respect to male-female differences. It may seem obvious that men perceive women in sexy bathing suits as objects. Now there's science to back it up. And I guess this is my plea to scientists to say, just be careful where you're going with the language you use. And in fact, the CNN then said this, of course, is a byproduct of human evolution. And it's to do with males seeking fertile women. I'm not quite sure what that's got to do with bikinis, but perhaps that's another talk. Okay, and this is just me making something up. There's a particular a particular newspaper in the UK, which is always a real, what we call a tabloid press, and this was my kind of image of what they might make of the story. I did make that up, but actually this was an image that was used. Okay, so we need to be careful. We need to say be careful of the language you use, because I've used it lightheartedly, but these are the kind of ways in which this can land up. And this is important because the other story behind, which is another whole story about the way in which brain imaging has not necessarily served the research agenda well, is that the very seductive nature of those images allowed people to produce books like Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps. And you will find in each of those books some reference to neuroscience research has shown. And the granddaddy of them all, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, etc. So how this research is used is also something that needs to be borne in mind. And I've called this unashamedly neurotrash. So something that we need to be careful of. So at the end then, how we might tell a better story. Anybody interested in doing research in this area or reading research in this area? First of all, is male or female the first and only question that you ask? Are you still being driven by the hunt the difference agenda? Remember that our brains are plastic. There are other variables that change the brain. A gendered world will make a gendered brain. If you find differences, do you report the effect size? Are we talking about tiny differences? Are we actually interpreting structural differences in terms of function differences we're not sure about? If you don't find any differences, do you report this? Do you discuss similarities? Are we making a big campaign of the fact that we're looking for differences when actually most of the results that we come up with report that men's and women's brains are actually much the same? And finally, the idea that we should mind our language and really look quite carefully at how fundamental or profound are our findings. So this was a kind of rattle through research in this area and how we should be careful what we're looking for. And if anybody wants to follow this up, again, this was a paper which has come across this. I don't know if it's actually come up. Okay, no. There is, this is just to say that there are other papers. Oh, here we are. Right. Okay. So this is a paper which, if you're really interested, Cordelia Fine and I wrote a paper, 8 things you need to know about sex, gender, brains and behavior for academics, journalists, parents, gender diversity advocates, social justice warriors, tweeters, Facebookers, everyone else not otherwise specified. So if anybody is still listening comes into these categories, there is a paper that you might like to look at, which extends on some of the things that I've just said. So I'm going to stop now and hopefully answer lots and lots of questions. Thank you very much.